Good afternoon, or perhaps good evening or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Allison Sammartano, Claims Supervisor at Gallagher Bassett, and I want to welcome you to Dive In's Getting Frank About Emotional Health and Suicide Prevention. The success of Dive In is down to the hundreds of volunteers who find time to organize these events while tending to their work and family obligations. We'd like to extend a huge thank you to our 22 global festival partners and all of our volunteers for their dedication and congratulate them all for creating a festival full of informative and inspiring discussions, as well as thanking our local sponsors for this event. A quick housekeeping, if you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them in the question box. Note that if you would like to submit your question anonymously, you can click on your name, change it to anonymous, so you have some privacy. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the session. Being a part of the Mental Health Committee this year has been an amazing experience. It has been so interesting getting to know everyone and finding out what led him or her or them to volunteer in the mental health realm. For me, here are my reasons. Brian McGuire, suicide by cop. Karen Hessick, overdose. John Serrain, overdose. Paul Romanowski, hanging. John Dubrick, overdose. Jeff Callahan, carbon monoxide asphyxiation. It was 1997 when one of my close friends, who was in recovery, relapsed, causing his depression to worsen. His death made the local newspapers when he died by suicide by cop. Suicide by cop is a term used by law enforcement officers to describe an incident in which a suicidal individual intentionally engages in life-threatening and criminal behavior with a lethal weapon, or what appears to be a lethal weapon, toward law enforcement officers or civilians to specifically provoke officers to shoot the suicidal individual in self-defense or to protect civilians. My friend Brian had a lethal weapon, his parents' car, which he proceeded to drive recklessly through the streets of Oaklawn, Illinois, jeopardizing the safety of himself, other drivers, pedestrians, and the police officers who were chasing him. Once the police were able to surround his car at a local park, Brian floored the gas and drove directly at an officer who had no choice but to shoot him to protect himself and civilians. 27 years old, I grieved the loss of my friend. I had never heard of suicide by cop and found myself researching as much as I could about the subject to try and make sense of what Brian had done. Didn't he care about his family or friends? I was completely heartbroken and lost. Fast forward to December 2019, one of my close friends for 30 years phoned to tell me that her 40-something-year-old brother had been in the ER for suicidal thoughts. Somehow, he convinced the ER doctor and my friend that he was fine and that everyone was just overreacting. He was released the following morning. Unfortunately, her brother Paul had some prior struggles with alcohol and depression. I was fortunate enough to know some people that could help him and arranged for him to go to an AA meeting Thursday evening. He canceled last minute, telling his sister, my friend, that Comcast was coming to fix something and he wouldn't be able to make it. It was Saturday afternoon when I received the call. In shock and disbelief, my dear friend told me that her brother Paul had hung himself. She was also completely lost. These are just two of the heartbreaking stories I have about people I have lost to suicide. Suicide is not an easy topic to talk about. For those of you who have seen the movie St. Elmo's Fire, it reminds me of that character Wendy's mom, who whispers what she considers difficult words such as cancer and prison. It used to be that people committed suicide, as if the individual carried out or committed an illegal action. Thankfully, the language is changing to died by suicide, which in my opinion is closer to the truth. Nobody aspires to die by suicide. When searching for speakers, I ran across a YouTube video of a person who calls himself the mental health comedian. Initially, I thought, what can be so funny about mental health? Then I realized his gift of taking a very difficult, challenging topic and adding in some levity to make it easier to talk about. He believes that where there is humor, there is hope. Where there is laughter, there is life, and nobody dies laughing. Frank King, nationally known suicide prevention and postvention speaker and trainer, was a writer for The Tonight Show for 20 years, is a corporate comedian, syndicated humor columnist, and podcast personality who was featured on CNN's Business Unusual. It is too late for the friends I mentioned, but Frank is here today to help us all make a difference and possibly save a life in the future. With that, I give you Frank King.
Thank you very much, Allison. There we go. Now it's working. Yes, I am the mental health comedian, and that is generally the first thing I address when I do a keynote live or virtually, because you may be asking yourself, a comedian talking about depression and suicide? I think it's a good choice. I'll tell you why. The world's first comedians were the court jesters, and their job was to speak truth to power on behalf of the powerless. With humor, I believe I speak truth to the power of mental illness on behalf of those powerless in its grip with humor. There's a reason they call it comic relief. Also, depression and suicide run in my family. It's called generational depression and suicide. My grandmother died by suicide, my great aunt. I believe my mother did slowly, but I'll talk about that and them a little later on. Often clients say to me, we just brought you in here to start the conversation. So here's the good news. 8 out of 10 people who are suicidal are ambivalent. 9 out of 10 who are suicidal give hints in the last week leading up to an attempt. The trick is, you have to know the signs and symptoms of depression and thoughts of suicide. What to do, what not to do, what to say, what not to say, and how to find resources. And we will cover that today. I'll give you your first lesson in being a mental health first responder. Because anybody can stop a suicide. It is the most preventable cause of death on the planet. You do not have to be a clinician. Yeah, and you do not have to psychoanalyze them. You're simply stepping in out of your comfort zone and planting seeds of hope. This is my favorite Martin Luther King quote for that reason. Because I believe in mental health, silence kills. 8 out of 10 people who die by suicide in the US at this point are men. And one of the reasons is something called toxic masculinity. Or when I was a kid in the South growing up, it was big boys don't cry. Men tend not to reach out for help with things mental or emotional. And we're working very hard to change that. Every year in the United States, 8 million people seriously contemplate suicide. 1.4 million attempt. 47,000 complete. Now in the US, that's 1 every 9 minutes. That's 146 a day. That's like a 737 going into the ground and everyone's lost every day. In the world, 1 person dies of suicide every 40 seconds. So it is not simply a problem here in the United States. It is a problem worldwide. This is my favorite song by this particular duo. I don't know if you know Big and Rich, but they're kind of a country, kind of rockabilly band, I guess. And they've got a song called Somebody's Got to Be Unafraid to Lead the Freak Parade. And that's really my job, is to lead the freak parade. To get up on stage and reveal that I live with 2 mental illnesses and wave my freak flag and rally my troops. Because what I've discovered is, even though hardly anybody talks about depression and suicide, if you bring it up, if you merely mention the words out loud, almost everyone has a story. When I do a keynote live, I have 15, 20 minutes of general Q&A, and I tell the audience, look, if you have a question or a story you want to share that you don't want to share with the entire group, then I'll hang out after I'm done and speak to each of you individually. And sometimes there's 2 people, sometimes there's 8 people lined up. Because what I've done is I've given them permission. I was vulnerable on stage. I get choked up when I tell my story. And I give them permission to give voice to their feelings and experiences surrounding depression, thoughts of suicide without recrimination. Because there is a stigma attached to mental illness, and there's an entirely different stigma attached to thoughts of suicide. It is frightening for neurotypical people to hear that someone is contemplating suicide. And I understand 2 reasons. One, because the person who's hearing it, they don't know what to say, or they're afraid they'll say the wrong thing. There's an old urban legend that you should never mention the word suicide in front of somebody who is depressed. And I love the reasoning, but as a comedian, I love the reasoning because it might give them the idea. Suicide? What idea? Why didn't I think of that? Trust me, it's crossed their mind. So that's the first myth I'm busting here today on thoughts of suicide and, feeling depressed. Let's see. I've done 6 TEDx talks on mental health. So you may have been able to wrap your mind around a comedian talking about depression, thoughts of suicide. You may now be having trouble. How did a comedian get 6 TEDx talks on mental health? Each one is on a different element in the mental health field. Each one is different. My lived experience is the same in each, but there's for example, my 3rd one was called Mental Benefits, the Evolutionary Advantages of Mental Illness. Because I kept bumping into people who were high functioning mentally ill who also had some other extraordinary abilities. They were great singers or comedians or writers or actors. And I thought this cannot be a coincidence. And the TEDx starts like this. What if those of us living with a mental illness are not living with a genetic mutation, but an amazing evolutionary adaptation? And what if mental illness is, as Malcolm Gladwell says of such things in his book, David and Goliath, a desirable disadvantage? You would never wish it on anybody, but oftentimes, if you're high functioning, it comes with certain advantages. I believe that I am not broken. I believe that my comedic ability, creativity, imagination is simply the flip side of my major depressive disorder and chronic suicidal ideation. And that's how I ended up with 6 TED Talks. Seth Godin, my favorite marketing guru, said, if you're looking for an idea worth spreading, and that's the premise of a TEDx or a TED Talk, an idea worth spreading, all you need is a tribe. My tribe is people who live with mental illness and thoughts of suicide, for whom the option of suicide is always on the menu as a solution for problems large and small. It's called chronic suicidal ideation. And here's an example. When I say large and small, my car broke down a couple of years ago. I had 3 thoughts unbidden. Get it fixed, buy a new one, or I could just kill myself. I know it sounds absurd, but I will wager there's somebody watching or listening right now who has chronic suicidal ideation. And what I just said out loud was an epiphany. Because every time I've spoken since 2014, there's been at least one person in the audience, sometimes more, who have chronic suicidal ideation. They do not know it has a name. They don't know it's a thing. They think because of the way their brain works, they're just some kind of freak and completely alone. I was at a college presentation. A young woman came up afterwards. She said, I want to thank you for your keynote. I said, you're welcome. She said, but I got to tell you, it made me weep. I said, how did it make you weep? She said, well, you know your story about your car, get it fixed, buy a new one, or you could just kill yourself? I go, yeah. She said, I've been having those thoughts all my life. I thought it was just me, that I was some kind of freak and completely alone. And, and when you said that out loud, I realized for the first time in my life that I'm not alone, and I wept. That's the power of starting the conversation. And it happens over and over and over again. There's Comedy Boy. That's the face I show the world every day. I paste on the smile, slip on my loafers, and walk through the world as if nothing is wrong. And most days, nothing is really wrong. Major depressive disorder is rarely situational. It's a cycle, like a wheel with a flat spot. Every now and then, the flat spot lands, and my cycle's 3 days. With major depressive disorder, it could be 3 days to 3 weeks, but mine just happens to be 3 days. And again, not situational. I've been most depressed and suicidal at some of the best times in my life. I know, again, sounds absurd, but that is major depressive disorder. And nobody knew that I was depressed and suicidal until age 52 when I did my first TEDx talk and came out on stage in front of the world, or as we used to say down south, in front of God and everybody, as depressed and suicidal. My family didn't know, my wife didn't know, my friends didn't know. I revealed because people who have mental illness oftentimes hide it. They don't want to be a burden. My thought process was, well, why tell anybody? They're not going to be able to do anything about it. Well, my wife didn't know. So before she was going to hit play on YouTube to watch my TED Talk, I said, look, before you hit play, I need to tell you about half a dozen things you don't know about me. And I told her about my suicidality and my depression, how close I came close enough in 2010, after we filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy and lost everything we'd worked for in 25 years. I came close enough to dying by suicide that I can tell you what the barrel of my gun tastes like. Spoiler alert, I did not pull the trigger. It's okay to laugh. Most audiences, there's this sort of cautious laughter. And then I tell the story of a friend of mine who came up after my keynote, and he thought he was being funny. And he goes, hey, man, how come you didn't pull the trigger? I go, hey, man, could you try to sound slightly less disappointed? Here's the deal with comedy and why comedy is so powerful with something like mental illness. A rule in comedy is you can make fun of any group to which you belong. If I were neurotypical, neuronormal, then I couldn't make fun. I couldn't poke fun at suicide and depression. But because I am double qualified, card carrying, mentally ill, that gives me license to and it's not jokes. It's like that funny anecdote I just told you. It's funny personal stories. Yeah, there's nothing to joke about with depression and thoughts of suicide. But in a mental health journey, there are often funny anecdotes that oftentimes make a point. So now let's see. I think the next one is yes. With apologies to the Showtime series Dexter, that is my dark passenger. The gentleman who took this photograph of me, the promo shot for comedy, said, Frank, I've got a project. It's a real camera, real film, natural light, and it's going into a kind of an art show. So what I want you to do is I want you to take the jacket off, leave the gray t-shirt on, and when you look into the camera, let something come flowing out of your eyes so that when people look at the picture, they'll think, wow, there's something going on behind those eyes. So for the first time in my life, I thought, I'll show you something. And I actually tried to mentally project that part of my personality that's been trying to kill me for decades. And I do believe he caught it. When I first saw the picture, I shuddered because I thought, oh, dear God, that's the part of my personality that's been trying to kill me for decades. Now, if there's an upside to chronic suicidal ideation, one is that when I speak, people learn they have it, and it has a name, and it is a thing, and they're not alone. The second thing is, suicide is most often not about wanting to die. It is simply about ending the pain. And because I have chronic suicidal ideation, and I am willing to take my life at any moment, I can stand a great deal of pain because I know I can make it come to an end. So ironically, my suicidal ideation keeps me alive. It's an odd sort of superpower. It is a silver lining in that condition, in addition to being able to share that with individuals and enlighten them that they are not, in fact, alone. Oops, where are we here? Let me back up. Well, I apologize, that was my revolver. This, by the way, is my chest. This is as close as I have come to dying since that time in 2010. That's an artificial heart valve. And when I got that's the second valve I got. I got one in 1995, a second one in 2012. And when they put this valve in, they did double bypass. And 2014, 2 years later, both those bypasses occluded on the same day. I was in the woods with the dogs, half mile up a logging trail by myself. I had T-Mobile, so I didn't have cell service. And it's okay to laugh at that. Everybody does. And now, a lot of people think if you're depressed and suicidal, it's 24/7, 365. And that is often not the case. If you're properly medicated and you're getting good therapy, you probably have more good days than bad. I have far more good days than bad. And that day I was in a good place. Now, if I had not been in a good place that day, if I had been suicidal that day, what I could have done is I could have sat down on the trail, let the heart attack run its course, and only the dogs would know that I chose to end my life. Because they would find my body, they would see the signs of a heart attack, and they just figure, oh, he had the heart attack, he couldn't get out of the woods, and then he had T-Mobile, so no cell service. but I was in a good place. And I had my 3 dogs, German Shepherd Rescues, with me. And my only goal in life at that moment was to get them back into the vehicle, because there was a busy logging road not 30 yards from where the car was parked, where we entered the logging trail, and logging trucks going by, and it would not have ended well for the dogs if they had been loose and not in the car. So my only goal was to get down the hill and get the dogs in the car. We're like the Marine Corps. We never leave anybody behind. So when people always ask me, as you're going down the hill having a heart attack, you're dying because the heart muscle's dying. Did you see a light? Did you hear dead relatives? Were you thinking about your wife? No. You know what I was thinking about? 2 weeks from that day, I was going to do my first TED Talk, that one I mentioned in 2014. And I'm crying on the way down the hill because I'm thinking of all the lives I could have saved if I could have just gotten to the TEDx stage 2 weeks hence and done my TEDx talk. Fortunately, I got to the car, drove home 2 miles, walked in the house, yelled to my wife, dialed 911, and I heard this. I'm in the bathroom. I got the fan on. I can't hear you. I walked half a mile, drove 2, and I'm going to die in my hallway. Obviously, I didn't die in my hallway. Transported to the hospital, and I got 3 stents in my arteries, and I was out the next day. I mean, it's amazing that it can happen that fast. I mean, by noon, I was eating a turkey sandwich, watching college football. That's how quickly they take. When you get to the hospital with a heart attack, there's no waiting. They pretty much roll you in there and start working on you. So anyway, that's as close as I've come to perishing since that time in 2010. Let's see. That's my grandmother. I mentioned that my grandmother died by suicide. That's my grandmother, my mother Dixie, on her lap. This is the eve of the Depression, to 1929. And my grandmother had just lost her husband. Now she's got to get herself and those 3 kids through the Depression without a husband. And she did. She got them through the Depression. She saw them all graduate high school, graduate college, and get married. And with her job done, she decided to end her life. She was struggling mentally. She knew it. Back then, the mental health facilities, I mean, can you imagine? And that would have been in the 40s sometime. I'm sure it was not, they were not, I mean, I can't even imagine. So now my mother got worried because she could not reach my grandmother on the phone. And so she decided to go over, and my grandmother had taken care of everything except, I don't know if you're old enough to remember the milkman. The milkman had delivered 2 bottles of milk to the front porch, and they were spoiling. The only thing my grandmother overlooked. She wrote the checks for the bills, stamped the envelopes, addressed them, put them on the kitchen counter. She pinned her will to her housecoat so my mother could find it. She blew the pilot light out on the old gas stove, and she sat down at the table, the kitchen table, and wrote this note.
My dear children, I am so sorry to leave you, but it can't be helped. All summer long, I have been going downhill. Doctors have done all they could, but in spite of them, my nerves have gone completely shot. I can't sleep, I can't eat, and my mind is sadly unbalanced. Under such conditions, life is absolutely unlivable. Be good, and meet me in the glory land. Heavenly Father understands. He has forgiven me, and I know you will too. Always my best love. Mother.
My great aunt died by suicide. She is the woman sitting next to the gentleman with the wonderful white beard. And this is she again later. She's standing in front of the gentleman. He has his hand on her arms. My mother and I discovered that she had died by suicide. My mother could not reach her on the phone. And given the family history, she got worried. So she bundled me into the car. We drove over to my great aunt's duplex and let ourselves in. And I'll spare you the details because they are horror movie horrible. But I was 4 years old when we discovered her body, and I screamed for days. So it's in my first TEDx talk called A Matter of Life or Death. It's my origin story, and I tell the story. And I tell the story of why I didn't pull the trigger that day when I tasted the barrel of my gun. So if you'd like to know those 2 stories, they're in my TEDx talk on YouTube called A Matter of Life or Death. Your life, don't fake it until you take it. This is what a lot of us do. We're great actors. I've got a Screen Actors Guild card. I can act. And it comes in handy when you are covering up or disguising your issues with mental health. I believe Robin Williams actually did this. He faked it until he couldn't take it, and he took his own life. I believe he was living with bipolar disorder, although he never said that. He did joke at length, great length, about his drug addiction or substance abuse disorder treatment and recovery, but never anything about being depressed or suicidal, except on Fresh Air on NPR one day. He was interviewed by Terry Gross, and if you listen carefully to the interview, you hear him say, life is not for everybody. And this was shortly before he passed away. So was he one of the 9 out of 10 who was giving hints in the week or so before he just decided to end his life? It is possible. Again, 8 out of 10 are ambivalent, 9 out of 10 give hints, and all you have to do is know the signs and symptoms, what to say, what not to say, what to do, what not to do, and find resources and be willing to step up and do something. Empathy, that's the hard thing to come by. Brene Brown said in a book on vulnerability that sympathy is I feel sorry for you, and empathy is I feel sorry with you. And it's difficult for people to wrap their minds around why life could be so bad, how life could be so bad that you would want to end it. And again, I believe that most suicides are not about ending your life, but simply ending the pain. And that's what, when people ask me, why do you think he killed himself? I don't believe he killed himself because he wanted to die. I believe he did that because I did not want to kill myself. I simply wanted to end the pain. Now, the upside of my pain is that, and Brene Brown said this in her book about her mental illness, is that I'm so comfortable in my darkness, I can sit comfortably with you in yours. That's the power of peer counseling, is somebody who's walked a mile in those moccasins and, knows. I give out my cell phone number at all my keynotes. And I said, look, if you're suicidal, call the hotline. If you're just having a bad day, call a crazy person. Here's my cell number. And about once a week, somebody will call because, if they don't have to explain anything, we hear the same music. I'm not going to judge them. I'm just going to help them walk through whatever nonsense they're wading through and do my best, to keep them among the living. People often ask me, tell me about your depression. What does it look and feel like? You guys remember these old diving suits? Yes, they came with a set of these, let's see, lead-filled boots. That's what it feels like to me. On that first day of the 3-day cycle, it feels like somebody's turned up the force of gravity. And it's harder and harder to put one foot in front of the other. And then on the second day, it bottoms out. And the third day, I began to go back up to flying at a good altitude, a normal altitude. But that's my cycle. Everybody's is different. The benefit of being 64 and a half years old and having gone through the cycle so many times is that I know the cycle. I know that if it starts, it'll be about 72 hours. And at the end of that period, I will be back to flying level again. The danger for younger people is that they haven't been through that cycle a number of times. And when you are having those suicidal thoughts, oftentimes you are only thinking in the immediate. You're thinking, if it's never going to get any better than this. So why bother? Very dangerous. But being an old guy and having gone through it multiple times, that works in my favor in terms of staying alive. Help is available. Let's see. Let me get the next slide. Oh, that's, by the way, is that you guys? I'm trying to figure that's where my first TED Talk is. FrankTEDTalk.com will take you directly to that YouTube video. So that's if you'd like to know my origin story. Certified Mental Health First Aider. This is a great program. Now online, as you might imagine, in the form of Zoom. It's an 8-hour day. There's an adult and a youth version of mental health awareness. You take a class, either an adult, a class on adult mental health or a class on youth mental health. And it costs anywhere from $5 to $25. And if you do it live, they throw in pizza for lunch. It's Mental Health 101. They give you a binder with all the information in it. So if you notice signs and symptoms, and we'll talk about those, you flip through that binder to what you think is going wrong, and there will be a list of symptoms. And also what to do, what not to do, what to say, what not to say, and how to find resources for that particular ailment. So I would recommend, if you get a chance, log on, find one near you, or find one on Zoom and take the class. Now, I'm not a diversity expert. However, there are differences between the suicide rates of various ethnic and cultural groups. ethnic, cultural, and so forth. And African Americans, oftentimes higher rate of suicide. It is in part because that in that community, people are less likely to come out to their friends and family. There are cultural norms, cultural taboos. I'd say cultural norms, where we just don't talk about that. So in the African American community, that is one reason why the rate of suicide is higher than in say for Caucasians in general. Native Americans, same thing. Not something that is generally discussed in that culture. And by the way, Native Americans, Alaskan Americans, and of course African Americans we just talked about. Hispanics, same thing. It is a cultural phenomenon. It is something that I've got friends who, I have a young woman that I know, she said, I came out to my mom that I was depressed. I said, what'd your mom say? Well, her mom had come to America from Mexico, very poor beginnings, grew up in a house on a dirt floor, struggled, came here legally, and, they clawed their way up the food chain, and they were relatively successful. But when her daughter said, I'm depressed, her mom said, what do you have to be depressed about? When I was your age, I was living in a hut with a dirt floor with barely enough to eat. So she didn't bring it up again. It's difficult for people who are neurotypical to understand how painful that is mentally when you are that depressed. I've often said, if you could go inside my head when I'm spiraling down, you'd come out about 5 minutes later just screaming. Like, how do you get by with that kind of thing going on in your head? Let's see. LGBTQ, higher rates of suicide, especially the T, transgender. 40% of transgender youth seriously contemplate suicide. That is 10 times the number who are heterosexual or cis, teenagers who contemplate suicide. 10 times. 4% is the heterosexuals and so forth, and then 40% for transgender. There are occupations, veterans, and military. Fortunately, the number of veterans dying per day has come down a bit. It was 22 for the longest time. Now it's 20. Still unacceptable, but it's 20. And it's not because the VA is not doing their job. It turns out that only 25 or 30% of veterans are on the books of the VA medical system. So you can't blame the VA for not treating people they don't know about. So what the groups I've worked with that work with the veterans, encouraging them to sign up and make sure that the VA is aware of what they're struggling with and can provide services. Veterinarians have a high rate of suicide. That's one of the groups I speak to most often. They come out of college with $350,000 in student loan debt, open a practice, another $250,000. So financial stress leads to mental stress and physical stress, and that exacerbates or creates mental and physical problems. Dentist, same thing, same basic business model. Lots of debt, long hours, little sleep, working through lunch, not going to the gym. Agriculture, serious problem in I've just cracked that nut. Agriculture resisted me since 2014. I just did my first ag conference in June. I've been after them for years, and they were actually offended that I called and mentioned that I thought maybe they would want to bring somebody in to talk about suicide prevention. And they said, that's just tasteless. That's just, I said, you're in the top 5. It's construction, mining, excavation, fishing, farming, forestry, and then the white collar. Dentists, veterinarians, physicians, attorneys, and agriculture is 9 or 10. So, healthcare. In the United States, we lose a physician, a doctor every day in, day out to suicide. Probably something you've never heard before. But, again, the pressures, especially with COVID. I mean, they're stretched so thin, and they were there. That was 400 a year before COVID. My concern is that probably the number is going to be larger post-COVID. Oh, QPR. That's the curriculum I teach. It's peer-reviewed, evidence-based, question, persuade, refer. This is what it is. Ask a question, save a life. Ask a question, start a conversation. Okay, now, let's talk about signs and symptoms of depression and thoughts of suicide. What to say, what not to say, what to do, what not to do. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the, I would say, top 3 indications somebody is living with depression. 1, they have trouble getting out of bed in the morning, but rallying in the afternoon. So maybe you've got a Zoom scheduled in the morning and they're always late. But then when you move the Zoom to the afternoon, son of a gun, they're on time. Indication maybe they're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning and, getting a shower and getting to work on time. The March of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, I realized that as a person with mental illness, high functioning, that I had something to offer neurotypical, neuronormal people that could perhaps save them as we worked our way through the pandemic. Because if you are high functioning mentally ill, you have something called a self-care plan. It's the old story about, put your own oxygen mask on first. So I have a self-care plan. And I shared that on podcast after podcast and keynote after keynote. My keynote's called Social Distancing and Staying Sane. Don't worry so much about your mentally ill friends, because we, if we're high functioning, chances are, have a self-care plan. Because as somebody who lives with mental illness, we wake up in an uncertain world every day, whether there's a pandemic or not. And we have to figure how to get out of bed some morning. We have to have techniques to help us get out of bed some morning, simply just to get out of bed and put your feet on the floor. And my self-care plan is diet. I'm on the keto diet, and I do intermittent fasting, exercise 5 days a week at the gym. Good night's sleep. A good night's sleep is restorative. Meditation, I meditate twice a day. It's called the Cat Napper. It's 29 minutes. It's a guided meditation. It's an MP3. It takes me down and then brings me back up the other end, rested, refreshed, and so forth. And finally, medication. So diet, exercise, good night's sleep, meditation, medication. I didn't take medication for the longest time. Not because I've got anything against Big Pharma or the insurance companies. It's because I found something called SAMe, S-A-M-E. You can buy it at Costco or any vitamin store. And it's really good on mild depression. And it got me over the hump most days. And when I turned 60, my wife said to me, just ask the doctor, see if there isn't something, something you could take. So I went to see my doctor, who, by the way, your physician, in the United States anyway, is supposed to ask you 2 gateway questions when you get there on your mental health every time. Have you felt hopeless in the last 2 weeks? Have you withdrawn from social activities you normally take great pleasure in? And if you answer yes to one of those, there's 7 more questions to follow up. And he had never asked me, and all the time, and with my heart issues, I was seeing him for a while every quarter and then every 6 months, never asked me. So I said to him, I'd like some antidepressants. And he said, why? I said, because I can tell you what the barrel of my gun tastes like. Couldn't grab the prescription pad fast enough. And I got a particular prescription. Now, took it to Walgreens. My pharmacist, Paul, took one look at the prescription, knew exactly what it was, and he said to me, are you depressed? Are you having thoughts of suicide? He said to me what my doctor should have said to me. My doctor should have said, do I need to refer you for therapy? Are you depressed? Are you having thoughts of suicide? Nope. A pharmacist, bless him, at the corner, Happy and Healthy in Walgreens, was the first one to ask. The medication I got, it turns out it really works well for me. After 2 weeks, my wife noticed the difference in my personality. I didn't notice till 3 weeks. And I had this thought unbidden. Hadn't had this since high school. I like my life. I've got a great life. But I'd never had that thought, hadn't had that thought since high school. And my second thought was, why did I wait so long to take the antidepressants? It makes a big difference. Now, the thing about psychotropic medications, I interviewed on my podcast a couple of folks who are doing a documentary on pharmacology on psychotropics. And they discovered in their research that 1/3 of the people who take, let's say, an antidepressant, a particular antidepressant, 1/3, it's okay. And the last third, it's a disaster. They have to taper off and then try something else. So the good news is nowadays, if it doesn't work, if whatever it is does not work for you, you can do a DNA cheek swab test, relatively inexpensive. And they take your DNA and they try to match it with an antidepressant or antipsychotic or anti-whatever that works best with your metabolism. So it cuts down on the lab rat business. You know, going on, doesn't work, taper off. Going on, doesn't work, taper off. So if mine had not worked for me, my next step would have been to get the DNA cheek swab. And most insurances cover it, several $100s generally. Not a big deal. And it's not perfect, but it allows you to dial in. You know, get closer to what will probably work best with your metabolism. So, has trouble getting up in the morning, rallies in the afternoon. Eat too much, can't eat. Or sleeps too much or can't sleep. And finally, and this is one you can notice on Zoom, they let their personal hygiene go. So if they log on for a Zoom and you look and you think, man, the hair's kind of dirty and the clothes aren't that clean, it may be because they're having difficulty getting out of bed in the morning to run a little wash and take a shower. And if you've never been depressed, how would you know that's what you have? That's what worried me, was all the people in the pandemic who were what they call situationally depressed. They were depressed because of the situation, simply because of the situation. And oftentimes people who are neurotypical, neuronormal resist taking, say, an antidepressant because they view it as a life sentence. It's not that way. It's there to help you get over the rough patches, and then when life levels out again at whatever new normal we land on, then you just taper off it. I have a cousin who I don't think she took an antidepressant until she's in her mid-50s, but she had a bout of depression. And she took the antidepressant for 6-8 months, and then the sun came out again, and she tapered off, and she never took them again. So it's not necessarily a life sentence if you're neurotypical and you're taking some antidepressants just to take the edge off. Okay, now what do you say to somebody who is depressed, or you believe is depressed, or they've admitted they're depressed? Here's what you don't say: pull yourself up by your bootstraps, turn that frown upside down. Have you tried joy? No, I'm sorry. Choose joy. That's it. Choose joy. I said to the person who told me that, unless you're talking about dishwashing liquid, I don't think that's going to help. And don't you think if it was simple as choosing joy, I would have done that 4 decades ago? Here's what you do say to someone who is depressed, or you believe is depressed, or they've told you they're depressed. I'm here for you and I mean it. I know you're not lazy, crazy, or self-absorbed. I know that depression is a mental illness. What I also know is with time and treatment, things will get better. I will take the time. I'll help you get the treatment. Now, here comes the difficult part. If you believe they're depressed or they admit they're depressed, you have to ask them in no uncertain terms, are you having thoughts of suicide? And if you cannot ask that question, you find somebody who can. But let's say they're not forthcoming about their thoughts of suicide, but your gut tells you that's what they're circling up to. How would you know? Well, here's some of the symptoms. They talk about death and dying. You catch them Googling death and dying. Death and dying appears as a theme in their artwork, their music, their writing. They're getting their affairs in order, especially if they're giving away things, their prized possessions, because they want them to go to the people they want them to go to when they're gone. And here's a counterintuitive one that I think is extremely dangerous. They've been depressed forever, and all of a sudden they're happy beyond measure for no apparent reason. Well, the problem is they may be happy because they've chosen time, place, and method, and they know, wait for it, the pain is finite. That's why they're happy. So you have to be very careful with that change in attitude. It could signal something far darker. Also, acquiring the means to die by suicide, whether it's stockpiling medication or buying a firearm. 3 times as many women in the world attempt suicide than men, but men tend to complete because they use a firearm. So more women than men, but men, for whatever reason, choose a firearm. Now, let's say they do tell you they are suicidal. They're willing to admit it. You say, do you have a plan? And if they have a plan, okay, what is your plan? And if it's detailed time, place, and method, you need to do your best to get them on the phone with a suicide prevention hotline, wherever you are. And if they won't pick up the phone and do it, you pick up the phone, and the volunteer on the other end will do their best to talk the phone into the hand of the person who is in crisis. Question comes up, when do you call the police. If they're an immediate danger to themselves or somebody else, you have no choice but to call the police. Now, in most states in the U.S., if the police get involved and they think they're actively suicidal, they will take them in front of a judge and try to get a 3-day involuntary detention order, 72 hours in a mental health facility, which is very controversial. And chances are the person who's having that done to them is not going to be happy. Probably going to unfriend you on Facebook, but at least they'll still be alive. So that's the signs and symptoms. Now, let's say they are suicidal, having suicidal thoughts, but they don't have a plan that's well formed. You know, it's still a bit nebulous as to time, place, and method. What do you say? Well, a psychiatrist and I, both of whom we both live with chronic suicidal ideation, we ask ourselves that question. What do you say if the plan's not well formed? And here's what we came up with. If they're suicidal but the plan's not well formed, you say, well, tell me, are you going to kill yourself? And if they say no, then you say, okay, tell me why not. Make them give voice to whatever it is that's keeping them here. Make them say it out loud, whether it's friends, family, animals, children, wife, spouse, partner, whatever it is. If you ask me why I don't die by suicide, I have several reasons. One is what I told you about, where I do a keynote and there's somebody in the audience who has chronic suicidal ideation and they don't know it has a name, they think they're some kind of freak. And by simply making an appearance at that event and sharing my story and being vulnerable and enlightening them that it is a thing, lots of us have it. I imagine there are people who don't come up afterwards who realize the same thing when I spoke. I had a woman come up at a dental conference. Everybody else is leaving the room. She's walking toward me. I can see she's crying. She gets to me. She's weeping so hard she cannot speak. So I took a chance and I said, you have chronic suicidal ideation. She nods. I said, you didn't know it had a name. Nod. You just thought you were some kind of freak. Nod. I said, well, do you have a therapist back home? Nod. I said, well, do me a favor. Make an appointment and tell the therapist all that you learned. And for goodness sakes, don't tell them you learned it from a comedian. I want them to take you seriously. Tell them you Googled it. A week later, I got an email from her. Frank, I think I was at that conference simply to meet you. You have changed my life. And I can't say that about a lot of people. That's the power of simply starting the conversation. Because most everybody who has a mental health story, mental illness story, is just waiting for somebody to give them permission. I feel like the permission fairy. You know, I give them permission to give voice to their feelings and experiences. So that is the protocol for spotting depression. What do you say, not say? What do you do, what not do? Same with thoughts of suicide. What do you say? Don't say. Oh, don't say to somebody who admits they're suicidal or you think they're suicidal, you've got so much to live for. It's not situational observant. You're being melodramatic. You're just looking for attention. Nobody who talks about it ever does it. Well, if 9 out of 10 people give hints in the week leading up to an attempt, somebody's talking about it. The trick is, now you know, and you can't unlearn this. And what you're looking for after the presentation today, you're looking for patterns. You know, you begin to spot some of the things I talked about. Maybe a sign or symptom of depression. Maybe a sign or symptom of their having thoughts of suicide that you learned today. And when you begin to see that pattern, that's the time to intervene. Because again, 8 out of 10 are ambivalent, can't make up their mind. 9 out of 10 give hints. That means we can save the vast majority of people if you're willing to start the conversation. Now, my self-care plan: diet, exercise, good night's sleep, medication, meditation. I also do something called gamification. How do I get out of bed on a morning when I just want to pull the covers over my head and binge watch the Queen's Gambit on Netflix? Well, gamification. I make a to-do list of 6 things. And the game is, and how I win is, once I scratch off number 6, I don't care if it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, broad daylight, I can go back to bed and pull the covers over my head and then binge watch the Queen's Gambit on Netflix because I win. It's gamification. When I work out at a gym that's 25 minutes away. What gets me to the gym on those days when I just can't seem to drag myself there is, my deal is, the game is, if I get to the gym and go in and do 1 rep of 1 exercise, I can turn around and go home. Now, I got to tell you, I've never done that. I'm usually there an hour, hour and a half. Although the last gig I did was March 13th of 2020, and I flew into Chicago and at lovely Hilton, great gym, nice elliptical runner. I got on it at 6 o'clock that night and thought to myself, I just want to go to bed. So I worked out, I did the elliptical for a minute, and then I'm done. I win. I went to bed. Next morning I got up, did it for an hour. That's gamification. Finally. And by the way, diet, exercise, good night's sleep, meditation, medication. You know what the through line is there? Those are all things I can control. That's what people who are high functioning mentally ill often are doing, is controlling the things they can control and let the rest go. They interviewed a guy who was in a space station for an entire year by himself. That's social isolation. I mean, every now and then, another spaceship came by, dropped groceries, but for the most part, he was alone for 365 days. And they said to him, how do you do that? How do you get by with that kind of social isolation? He said one word: routine. Again, something you can control oftentimes. He said, I go to bed about the same time, I get up about the same time, eat about the same time, exercise about the same time, binge watch Netflix same time, every day. He said, it's the routine. Because he said, I know why you're asking, because on Earth, because of the pandemic, everybody's routine has been, turned upside down. So you have to recreate, you have to reestablish a routine for yourself and for your loved ones. I would say I'd get a big giant whiteboard if I had a family like with 3 generations living in the same house. I got a giant whiteboard and work out everybody's schedule on the whiteboard, and and set up a routine. Who cooks tonight, who cleans tonight, who washes dishes tonight. Routine. So those are things: my self-care plan, gamification, and routine. And now it's time for Q&A.
Q&A. Awesome. Thank you, Frank. It was fantastic. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience did as well. We do have a lot of questions. The first one is, how do you work through having an unfriendly family environment to discuss mental health or even consider seeking help while also having social anxiety?
Yikes. Well, I always say that you should come out to your family on your mental health issues if you know, love, and trust them. The last thing you want is to come out and then, as the young woman, whose mom was from Mexico, said, what do you have to be depressed about? When I was your age, I was living in a hut with a dirt floor. Oftentimes, again, if you've never been mentally ill, it's hard for neurotypical people oftentimes to wrap their mind around mental illness because you cannot see it. I've got a cousin who has bipolar disorder. She says, I wish I had cancer because all my hair would fall out and people would bring me casseroles. But living with bipolar, you can't see it. And, you don't get that kind of sympathy, empathy, and help. I think that person should, do a telemedicine appointment with a mental health provider. And oftentimes, if you work somewhere, they have an EAP, Employee Assistance Program, call HR and find out what mental health benefits do we have. And then if there's social anxiety involved, then it seems to me that the Zoom or virtual appointment would be much easier on somebody like that. And don't do it when the rest of the family's in the house. They're going to make fun of you. And then I would also get a physical. Sometimes physical ailments manifest as mental health or mental illness symptoms. So I would get a physical and then also get a mental health checkup and figure out what it is. Is it social anxiety and depression? Is it simply social anxiety? I would try to narrow down whatever it is. And again, I'm sorry the family is not supportive. It's, mental health, mental illness and suicide frighten people. And it's one of the reasons.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Frank. Yeah, great recommendations. And okay, our next question. If someone mentions having had suicidal thoughts in the past, how do you stand beside them supportively and not insert yourself into their story?
Well, I would say that you ask them, are you currently having thoughts of suicide? And if that is not the case, then I would ask them to tell me the story. I mean, how did you get to that point? Is it something that, that is perhaps in your DNA, runs in your family? Was it situational? Was it a situation that got you so close? Or most people at some time in their lives have had thoughts of, what the heck, why bother, why go on? But it's not in their DNA. It's not, they're not clinically depressed. They're just depressed because they filed bankruptcy or they flunked out of school or they got divorced. So I would ask leading questions. Tell me about that. You were married. Well, what was the story with your marriage when and then just rather than insert yourself by making statements, just ask leading questions and get them talking and listen actively and don't look at your watch.
Okay, that's great. Good advice. Where does the insurance industry land, would you say, in terms of suicide and depression risk?
Well,
I know you
having
used
been in
to
these,
work in insurance. Hmm.
yes, I was a marketing rep for a PNC company a couple of years, an independent agent for a couple of years, and then sold health, life, and disability for New England Financial for a couple of years. And it's a great business, although it wasn't for me. I mean, I was suicidal. I knew I should be a comedian, and that's why I became a comedian, because I was suicidal, and I knew if I stayed in insurance and married to my first wife, who was a lovely woman, but just not for me, I was going to kill myself. So, I thought, well, what the heck? I could divorce my wife, quit the insurance business, try comedy. If it works, great. If it doesn't, I can still kill myself. And you'd be surprised how many entrepreneurs have the same basic thought process. Of course, I figured it was just me. Nobody ever thought that before. And I've met some entertainers and entrepreneurs, same thought process. Is that no? I think I am delighted, by the way, that thanks to the ACA, which is not perfect, but it made a parity between mental health benefits and physical health benefits. So if I go to the hospital with a heart attack, it's 80% they pay, 20% I pay after my deductible. And then with mental health, if I have a bipolar meltdown, then the insurance company pays 80%, I pay 20%, and of course my deductible. So I think the insurance business has come a long way since when I came so close to dying by suicide, my insurance policy, and it was a good one, had 6 visits with a psychologist, 6 a year. And I've already got heart issues, pre-existing conditions. As absurd as it sounds, I didn't want another pre-existing condition. So I risked killing myself so that I didn't have to fess up that I had another pre-existing condition, because it was hard enough to get it with high cholesterol and heart valve problems. I mean, you layer on mental illness, and I'm not sure I could have gotten health insurance. So it's
Sure.
fortunately
Okay.
changed.
Thank you for that. Okay. Someone's asking, how would you get a 15-year-old teenager to do the 5-step plan, diet, exercise, etc.? All she will do is medication. She has major depressive disorder.
Well, and some people are strictly, they look for a pharmacological solution. I take a more holistic approach. I think, if she doesn't want to, then pressuring her into a self-care plan beyond medication might be counterproductive. It's like people say, you should exercise. Well, you know what? If you like exercise, great. If exercise stresses you out, that's not going to help with your mental health. So perhaps I hope there's something else that she can do that she likes to do, yoga, or I guess the answer would be try to find some things like diet, exercise, good night's sleep, things that she can control that she enjoys doing, that she could add to her self-care plan.
That's great. Good point. Not everybody's self-care plan is obviously going to be the same.
No.
Um,
I love exercise, but I've got friends who hate it, and that's not going to help.
yeah, sure. If someone you care about threatens suicide, will they really go through with it unless you do what they ask?
Well, that is a very popular technique, sort of an emotional blackmail. And I think if I were in that situation, it's usually, if you break up with me, I'm going to kill myself. Then I would say, oh, well, so you're having thoughts of suicide. Do you have a plan? And if so, what is your plan? Find out just how serious they are. The problem with just, going along with that is that people tend to repeat things that work. So I've I've got friends whose mom or dad, that was their MO. Every time things got tough and, you know, the things didn't go their way, well, I'm just going to kill myself. And every time the family jumped, you know, to the ready, and it's like self-reinforcing. So again, if somebody's doing that, you need to look for patterns. Are they talking about death and dying? Are they Googling death and dying? Is it a theme in their music, artwork, writing? See if there are other things, so you put together a pattern. If it just comes out of the blue, you know, if you break up, man, I'm gonna kill myself. I would be dubious.
Sure. Okay. And just in the last minute here, you should probably share your last slide and kind of wrap it up. So thank you again for being with us, and turn it over to you.
Well, I like to leave people on a positive note with some hope, because the QPR that I work with is not therapy, and I'm not a clinician. My job is simply to plant seeds of hope. The good news is, and we've talked about this before, 8 out of 10 people who are suicidal are ambivalent. 9 out of 10 give hints in the week leading up to an attempt, and now you know all about that. So you can make a difference. You can save a life, and you can do it by doing something as simple as we're doing right here, and that is, wait for it, starting the conversation.